For 37 years, I prepared myself for Christmas knowing that no one would come. I never said that out loud. I never needed to. The understanding settled quietly inside me over time, like dust on furniture that no one touches anymore. That morning, the morning everything finally shifted, I was standing just inside my front door while my daughter-in-law spoke, her voice careful, measured, polite in the way people are when they believe politeness will soften what they are about to take. I shut the door while she was still speaking. It was not a dramatic motion. I did not raise my voice. I did not hesitate. The door closed with a simple, final sound, and for a moment I stood there with my hand still resting against the wood, listening to the silence return. I did not feel brave. I did not feel cruel. What I felt was something unfamiliar and steady, as if a long argument inside me had finally ended without my permission. The house behind me was already quiet. It had been quiet long before she arrived. Large houses collect silence differently than small ones. Sound doesn't bounce back at you. It disappears. Over the years, I learned to live gently inside it, moving slowly, not because I was afraid to make noise, but because there was no one left who needed to hear me. That morning began like every Christmas Eve I can remember. I woke just before 6, the way I always do now, my body deciding for me that rest had been sufficient. I lay still for a few moments, staring at the ceiling, tracing the faint outline of the chandelier as the gray light of early winter filtered through the curtains. My joints ached in the familiar way they always do when the weather turns cold. Pain, like silence, becomes easier to manage when you stop fighting it. I sat up, placed my feet on the cold floor, and waited until the stiffness eased enough for me to stand. There was no rush. No one was waiting for breakfast. No one would notice if I moved slowly. I wrapped my robe around myself and slid my feet into slippers that had molded to the shape of me over years of quiet use. As I walked down the hallway, my steps echoed softly against marble floors that had once been chosen for gatherings, for celebrations, for voices overlapping each other in warmth. Those moments had passed, but the floors remained, polished and empty, holding memories they no longer released easily. I passed closed doors without opening them, rooms prepared long ago for people who never stayed. A guest room my son once used when visits were still frequent. A bedroom I had imagined filling with the sound of grandchildren, now frozen in usefulness. The kitchen lights flicked on, revealing a room that was clean but undecorated. No wreaths, no garlands, no effort made to convince myself this day was different from any other. I had stopped decorating years ago, after realizing that the work was not an act of joy, but of hope, and hope had become something I could no longer afford to waste. Still, habit is persistent. I opened the drawer where I kept an old notebook filled with menus from Christmases past. Page after page listed the same meals, written carefully in my own hand. Roasts, sides, desserts, prepared in quantities meant for people who never arrived. I closed the notebook without choosing anything. The decision felt strangely easy. The phone rested on the counter, silent. It had been silent for days. I did not check it. Waiting for a call that does not come teaches you nothing new after a while. It only confirms what you already know. The morning passed quietly. I moved through the house, straightening cushions no one would sit on, wiping surfaces that did not need wiping. Routine filled the hours, not with purpose, but with movement. Loneliness does not always announce itself with tears. Sometimes it simply gives you too much time to notice everything that is missing. By late morning, sunlight stretched thin across the front hall. That was when the doorbell rang. Once, then again, softer, as if the person pressing it was already uncertain. I did not hurry. Urgency belongs to people who expect something in return. When I opened the door, she stood there with her hands folded neatly in front of her, her smile practiced and careful. She said my name as if testing whether it still held meaning. She did not step forward. She waited, already measuring what this visit might cost her. She said she would only be a moment. She spoke about timing, about misunderstandings, about how difficult things had been lately. Her words were arranged carefully, like furniture positioned to hide empty spaces. I listened without interrupting. Listening has always been something I do well. As she spoke, I noticed small details, how young she still looked, how little seemed to have touched her compared to me. I wondered briefly if she had any idea what time demands in return for its passing, or if that lesson comes only after you have spent most of it. When she finally paused, waiting for reassurance, I did not give it. Silence does not frighten me anymore. It frightens people who are used to being heard. She stepped closer then, lowering her voice, and I saw it clearly. Not guilt, not kindness, calculation, the quiet confidence of someone who believed the door would open because it always had before. That was when I understood she had not come to reconnect, she had come to ask, and in that understanding, something inside me finally settled. I thanked her for coming. I told her I needed time. Relief flickered across her face, quick and unguarded. She mistook restraint for weakness. As she continued speaking, offering assurances meant to sound gentle, I closed the door. I stood there afterward, listening to the silence reclaim its place, knowing this moment wouldn't end anything today. It would only begin something I had been postponing for 37 years. After I closed the door, I remained where I was, not because I was unsure of what I had done, but because my body needed time to catch up to the decision my mind had already made. The foyer felt larger than usual, the ceiling higher, the air heavier. Silence settled around me in layers, the way it always does when the house decides it belongs only to me again. I rested my hand briefly on the console table, steadying myself, not from weakness, but from the unfamiliar feeling of standing my ground. I took off my coat slowly and hung it back in the closet, smoothing the sleeve as if it mattered. Small gestures keep moments from becoming exaggerated in memory. I did not want this to grow into something dramatic in my mind. I wanted it to stay exactly what it was. A door closed, a choice made. I walked back into the kitchen and poured myself a cup of tea that had already gone lukewarm. I drank it without reheating. I have learned over the years that insisting on perfection is a form of denial. Life rarely arrives at the right temperature. You take it as it is, or you leave it untouched. As I stood at the counter, my thoughts returned not to what she had said, but to how confidently she had said it. There had been no fear in her voice, no hesitation. She had spoken as someone who believed access to me was guaranteed. That realization stayed with me longer than anything else. Assumptions, I have learned, are built quietly, brick by brick, each time you make yourself available without being asked. The rest of the morning passed slowly. I occupied myself with tasks that did not require thought. I polished silverware I had not used in years. I reorganized shelves that were already neat. I opened drawers and closed them again, just to feel the passage of time. Loneliness does not always ache. Sometimes it simply stretches. Around noon, I stood by the front window and looked out over the drive, half expecting to see her car still there, as if she might return and knock again, insist on finishing her sentence. The driveway was empty. I felt a small release in my chest, subtle but unmistakable. It surprised me how relieved I was not to be pursued. I thought of my son then, not with anger, but with a distant kind of curiosity. I wondered when silence had become his preferred form of communication, when absence had replaced explanation. I tried to recall the last Christmas he had called on his own without being prompted. The years blurred together. 1 became 3, 3 became 5. Time compresses memories when there is nothing new to anchor them. In the early afternoon, I sat in the living room with a book open on my lap. I turned the same page several times without reading it. My eyes traced the words, but my mind kept drifting elsewhere, not to specific moments, but to patterns. Invitations declined politely at first, then vaguely, then not at all. Promises softened over time until they dissolved completely. Next year stretched endlessly, losing meaning with each repetition. I remembered the first Christmas after my husband died. People had told me that would be the hardest one. They brought casseroles, sat with me, spoke gently. They were wrong. That year, grief explained my solitude. The harder Christmases came later, when grief was no longer the reason, when solitude stopped being temporary and became expected. The phone rang once that afternoon. I looked at it from across the room and did not move immediately. It rang again, then stopped. The silence afterward felt deliberate, as if someone had decided not to leave a message. When I finally checked, there was a missed call from a number I recognized even without the name attached. I did not return it. I had spent enough years chasing conversations that never truly arrived. As evening approached, the light outside faded earlier than I expected. Winter has a way of stealing daylight without apology. I turned on a few lamps, not to brighten the house, but to define it, to keep the rooms from dissolving into shadows. I noticed how much space there was between the furniture, how much room life had once filled and now vacated. Empty space changes shape over time. It stops feeling temporary and starts feeling intentional. I prepared a simple dinner for myself and ate standing at the counter. Sitting at the table felt unnecessary. The table had been set for too many people who never came. I washed the dishes immediately, listening to the water run longer than needed. Sound, even the most ordinary kind, can feel like company when you allow it. Later, as I prepared for bed, I paused longer than usual in front of the mirror. I studied my reflection without judgment. The lines on my face were deeper than I remembered, but my eyes looked clearer than they had in years. I realized how often I had mistaken patience for obligation, how many times I had confused love with availability. Those realizations did not arrive with anger. They arrived quietly, the way truth often does when it knows you are finally ready to hear it. When I lay down, sleep did not come quickly. My mind returned to the moment at the door, to the brief flicker of relief on her face when she thought I might agree. I understood then that this was not the first time she had come asking. It was simply the first time she had done it in person. That thought stayed with me as the house settled around me, unresolved, waiting, as if it sensed that something long delayed had finally been set in motion. The next morning arrived without ceremony, the way mornings usually do when something important has happened and the world refuses to acknowledge it. Light filtered through the curtains in a thin, colorless way, spreading itself across the bedroom walls without warmth. I lay still for a long time, not because I was tired, but because I was listening to the house. After years of living alone, you learn the difference between ordinary quiet and the quiet that follows a decision. This one felt settled, as if something had finally been placed where it belonged. When I got out of bed, I moved slowly and with intention. I chose my clothes carefully, even though I had nowhere to go. A soft sweater, clean trousers, shoes I usually reserved for leaving the house. There is dignity in preparation, even when no one will see the result, especially then. I brushed my hair, fastened a simple necklace, and stood for a moment looking at myself in the mirror. My face looked older than it once had, but clearer, less burdened by anticipation. I did not rush away from my reflection. In the kitchen, I made coffee and sat at the table instead of standing at the counter as I usually did when eating alone. The chair across from me remained empty, but it no longer felt accusatory. It was simply a chair. For years I had allowed empty spaces to question me. That morning I let them exist without explanation. The phone rang just after 10. I dried my hands before answering, already knowing who it would be. My son's voice sounded careful, controlled, like someone approaching a conversation he hoped would resolve itself quickly. He did not ask how I was. He did not mention Christmas or the day before. Instead, he spoke about small things, traffic, errands, details meant to soften the ground before stepping onto it. I waited. Eventually, he brought up his wife's visit, framing it gently, calling it concern. He said she had only stopped by to check on me. He hoped I hadn't misunderstood her intentions. I told him calmly that she had come to ask for help. The silence that followed was unplanned, heavy with truth neither of us had named before. He sighed, not with regret, but with resignation. He admitted things had been difficult lately. Bills had piled up. Expenses had grown. He spoke as if these problems had appeared on their own, separate from choices, separate from patterns. He did not ask whether I could help. He assumed I would. That assumption sat between us, larger than anything else said. I realized then how long that assumption had existed, how often my willingness had been mistaken for obligation, how many times my silence had been interpreted as consent. I told him I needed time to think. He agreed too quickly, relief creeping into his voice, mistaking delay for agreement. After the call ended, I sat very still. My hands were steady, my breathing unchanged. There was no rush of guilt, no familiar tightening in my chest, only awareness, awareness of how long this pattern had been shaping my life without my permission. The rest of the day moved slowly. I went outside for a short walk around the property, my coat pulled tight against the cold. Winter had stripped the grounds bare. Trees stood without decoration, branches exposed, honest. I found comfort in that. There is clarity in things that no longer pretend to be full. As I walked, memories surfaced, not as scenes but as impressions. Years of being needed only when something was required, invitations that arrived late, if they arrived at all, phone calls that ended once the favor had been granted. I had always told myself this was normal, that children grow busy, that parents adapt, that this was simply the cost of time passing. It was easier than admitting how invisible I had become. By late afternoon, clouds gathered, darkening the sky earlier than expected. I returned inside and turned on lamps one by one, defining the rooms again. The house felt watchful, not in judgment, but in recognition. It knew me better than anyone else did now. It had seen every version of me, every adjustment, every quiet concession. Another call came that evening. I let it ring until it stopped. I did not check who it was. Some conversations lose urgency once you recognize their shape. I prepared a simple dinner and ate it slowly, seated, aware of each bite. Eating alone no longer felt like waiting. It felt like choosing. Later, I sat in the living room with a book open in my lap, though I read very little. My thoughts returned again and again to the ease with which both of them had assumed my answer. I wondered when I had taught them that my life was flexible, that my time was endlessly available, that my needs were negotiable. Perhaps I had taught them every time I said yes without being asked. As night settled in, the house grew quieter, deeper. I prepared for bed without hurry. When I lay down, I stared at the ceiling, not planning, not strategizing, simply noticing. I understood then that pressure would return, requests would be repeated, explanations would be expected. But for the first time in years, I did not feel the urge to prepare a response in advance. I closed my eyes knowing this calm would not last, knowing something was coming. But I also knew that whatever came next, it would not be met by the same woman who had answered the phone so many times before. The invitation arrived 2 days later, folded neatly inside a thick cream envelope, my name written in my son's careful handwriting. I recognized it immediately, not because of what it was, but because of how it made my chest tighten before I even opened it. Important messages have a weight to them. You feel them before you understand them. I carried the envelope into the sitting room and placed it on the table beside me, letting it rest there for a while. I made tea first. I waited for the kettle to boil, for the cup to warm my hands, for my breathing to settle. I have learned that rushing toward things rarely improves what you find. When I finally opened it, the card inside announced a family gathering, not Christmas, something later. A celebration. There were details about time and place, directions carefully printed, as if clarity could replace warmth. At the bottom, in smaller writing, was a note asking me to attend. It said it would mean a lot to them. It did not say to whom. I sat with the card in my lap and stared at the words until they blurred. It was strange how easily my body responded to the invitation, how quickly old instincts stirred. For years, being included, even conditionally, had felt like relief, like proof that I still existed in their world. I wondered if this was what she had come to soften me for. The days that followed passed quietly, but with an undercurrent I couldn't ignore. Phone calls increased, brief and polite, never quite addressing the door, never quite acknowledging the request that hovered unspoken between us. My son spoke carefully, as if afraid the wrong word might push me too far in the wrong direction. His wife did not call again. I agreed to attend. The decision surprised me even as I made it, not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to see clearly. There are moments in life when distance offers clarity, and others when only proximity does. I suspected this was the latter. The day of the gathering arrived cold and bright. I dressed slowly, choosing something understated, nothing that drew attention. I did not want to arrive as a spectacle. I wanted to arrive as myself. When I looked in the mirror before leaving, I saw a woman who had learned how to wait without disappearing. That felt new. The venue was crowded when I arrived. Voices overlapped. Laughter rose and fell in waves. I stood just inside the entrance for a moment, letting my eyes adjust, letting myself become visible before being seen. No one noticed me at first. That too felt familiar. When my son finally spotted me, his face lit up with something that looked like relief. He came toward me quickly, embraced me briefly, then stepped back, already distracted by someone calling his name. His wife approached more slowly, her smile practiced, her eyes measuring. She kissed my cheek lightly, as if we were acquaintances who had agreed to be polite in public. I took my seat among people who knew my name but not my life. Conversation flowed around me, touching on safe topics, work, travel, children's achievements. I nodded when appropriate, smiled when expected. I noticed how often my presence was used as proof of harmony. Look, she's here. Everything must be fine. At one point, a microphone appeared. Someone tapped it lightly, drawing attention. Speeches began. Gratitude was expressed, support acknowledged, sacrifices mentioned in general terms without names attached. When my son spoke, he thanked many people, friends, colleagues, his wife's parents. He did not look at me. I felt something shift then, not sharply, but decisively. The room seemed to grow louder, brighter, more distant all at once. I realized I was not there as a person. I was there as context, as background, as evidence of something they wanted others to believe. After the speeches, my son approached me again, his expression softer now, almost rehearsed. He spoke quietly, leaning close, telling me how glad he was that I had come. He mentioned how good it looked for everyone to be together. He said the word together as if it included me by default. His wife joined us then, placing a hand lightly on his arm. She spoke about how much they appreciated family support, how important it was to have everyone on the same page. Her eyes met mine briefly, then moved away, already searching the room. I listened. I did not interrupt. I did not challenge them. There is a particular clarity that comes when you stop trying to be understood. You begin to see instead. As the evening wore on, I noticed how often requests were framed as compliments, how gratitude arrived preemptively, before consent, how expectation disguised itself as affection. I saw it clearly, not just in them, but in how easily I had accepted it for years. When it was time to leave, no one stopped me. No one asked if I was all right. My absence from the room was unnoticed, just as my presence had been. Outside, the cold air felt sharp and honest against my face. I stood for a moment before getting into my car, steadying myself, not from sadness, but from understanding. Something had broken open inside me, quietly, completely. As I drove home, the house waiting for me felt less like an echo and more like a boundary. When I closed the door behind me that night, the sound was familiar now, solid, certain. And I knew, without yet knowing how, that the next conversation would not be like the ones before. The morning after everything happened did not arrive with drama, no thunder, no sudden clarity crashing through my thoughts. It came quietly, the way mornings always had, with pale light pressing against the curtains and the low, familiar hum of the house settling around me. And yet I knew before I even opened my eyes that something fundamental had changed. For decades, my mornings had begun with a kind of mental inventory. Who might call today? Who might need something? What problem would arrive unannounced and demand my attention before I had even finished my tea? That routine had shaped my days more reliably than any clock. But this morning, there was no list forming in my mind, no anticipation, no low-level panic dressed up as responsibility. There was only stillness. I stayed in bed longer than usual, not because I was tired, but because I was listening to my own thoughts, to my breathing, to the silence that had once terrified me and now felt oddly neutral. The silence did not accuse me of failing anyone. It did not whisper reminders of who I was supposed to be. It simply existed. When I finally stood up, my body felt lighter, as if I had put down a heavy bag I didn't realize I'd been carrying. I moved through the house slowly, touching familiar surfaces, grounding myself in the physical reality of my life. This house had held me through grief, through loneliness, through years of waiting for gratitude that never arrived, and yet it was still standing. So was I. I made breakfast and sat at the table instead of eating while standing at the counter, a habit I'd developed without noticing. Sitting felt deliberate. It felt like a choice. I finished my meal without rushing, without leaving crumbs behind as evidence of distraction. That small act felt symbolic, though I didn't dwell on it at the time. The phone lay face up on the table, unmoving. I glanced at it occasionally, not with hope or dread, but with curiosity. Would they call? Would they test the boundary I had finally drawn? Part of me knew they would. Boundaries, after all, feel like rejection to those who benefited from the absence of them. Late in the morning, I began sorting through old files and papers. It was not something I had planned to do. My hands simply reached for the drawer where I kept years of documents. I had avoided it because looking too closely at the past sometimes forces you to see patterns you worked very hard to ignore. There were bank statements, loan documents, receipts for school fees, medical expenses, emergency transfers labeled vaguely so I wouldn't have to think too much about them. Each page represented a moment when I had said yes instead of asking whether I should. Each signature carried my quiet assumption that love meant sacrifice, and that sacrifice, if done long enough, would eventually be recognized. I added up numbers without meaning to. My breath caught when I realized how much of my life had been translated into financial support, quietly given, rarely acknowledged. Not once had I been asked whether I could afford it. Not once had anyone suggested I deserved rest in return. Still, I did not feel anger. Anger would have implied surprise. What I felt was understanding. I had trained them well. I had taught them that my needs were flexible, optional, endlessly postponable. And now, unlearning that lesson would be uncomfortable for all of us. In the afternoon, I went outside and walked the perimeter of the property. The sky was gray, the air cool. Each step felt intentional, as if I were reclaiming ground not just beneath my feet, but inside myself. I thought about all the times I had been praised for being so independent, for managing so well on my own. I had mistaken those compliments for care. Now I saw them for what they were: relief. Relief that no one had to worry about me. Relief that my loneliness never demanded attention. Relief that my strength made their absence easier to justify. When I returned inside, the house felt different again. Not empty, not full, but balanced, as if it were finally aligned with the life actually being lived inside it, rather than the one I had been saving space for. The phone rang in the early evening. I recognized the number instantly. My hand hovered over the table, but I did not reach for it. I listened to the ringing, calm and steady, until it stopped. There was no rush of guilt afterward, no internal argument, just quiet certainty. Dinner that night was simple. I ate slowly, cleaned up carefully, and put everything away. I noticed how often in the past I had left small messes behind, as if expecting interruption at any moment. That habit no longer made sense. Later, I sat in the study, the room I had once avoided because it reminded me too much of a life that had ended. That night, it felt welcoming rather than painful. The books, the desk, the chair, it all felt like an invitation, not a memorial. I picked up a book and began to read, not to escape, not to fill time, but because I wanted to. The words settled into me differently now, unhurried, unfiltered by obligation. Before bed, I thought about what would come next. I knew this piece would not be unchallenged. There would be accusations, ultimatums, attempts to rewrite the story so that my refusal became cruelty. I was prepared for that in a way I had never been before, because for the first time, I understood something clearly. Choosing myself did not mean I loved them less. It meant I was no longer willing to disappear in order to be loved at all. And as I turned off the light, I felt something unfamiliar but welcome settle into my chest. Not guilt, not sadness, but resolute. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt almost artificial at first, like I was borrowing someone else's life and waiting to be asked to return it. Each morning arrived quietly, without demands, without the sense that I was already late for something invisible. I woke, dressed, ate, and moved through my hours with an awareness that made everything feel sharper. Sounds lingered longer, light stayed on surfaces, time stretched in ways it never had when my thoughts were always elsewhere. They did not call again that first day, or the next. The silence felt deliberate, like a test. I recognized it immediately because I had used silence myself once or twice long ago when I still believed distance could teach people how much they mattered. Silence, I had learned too late, only teaches people how to live without you. I spent those days observing rather than acting. That was new for me. I had always been someone who responded quickly, filled gaps, smoothed discomfort before it hardened into conflict. Now I let moments pass without interference. When the phone stayed quiet, I did not rush to explain my absence to myself. When thoughts surfaced, memories, regrets, justifications, I let them come and go without chasing them. In the afternoons, I returned to sorting through my papers, but with no sense of urgency. I organized slowly, placing documents into neat stacks, labeling folders with care. It might have looked like busy work from the outside, but to me it felt like something else entirely. It felt like acknowledgement, proof of what had been given, evidence of choices made consciously, even if unwisely. Every receipt told a story I had once refused to read closely. Emergency payments made late at night, transfers marked temporary help that were never temporary, letters from banks written in careful language, always polite, always firm. I noticed how often my own handwriting appeared beside phrases like cosigner and guarantor, how casually I had accepted long-term consequences in moments of short-term emotion. I did not feel foolish. That surprised me. Instead, I felt clear. Clear about what I had done. Clear about why I had done it. And clear about why I would not do it again. One afternoon, a neighbor waved as I walked back from the mailbox. We exchanged a few words about the weather, about nothing of importance. As I turned toward my door, she said something simple, almost thoughtless. "You always seem so calm." I smiled politely, but the comment stayed with me. Calm. I had been called many things in my life, reliable, generous, strong, but calm was not one of them. Calm requires a sense of safety. It requires the belief that you will not be punished for standing still. That evening, the phone rang again. I answered this time, not because I felt compelled, but because I was curious. My son's voice sounded measured, careful, as though he were speaking to someone unpredictable. He asked how I was. I told him I was fine. There was a pause, heavy and deliberate, waiting for more. I offered nothing. He cleared his throat and said they had been busy. I said I understood. He mentioned the children. I listened. He did not apologize. He did not ask questions. He spoke as though time itself had smoothed everything over, as though my silence had simply been an intermission. When he finally paused, I said only one thing. I said I would call him when I had something to say. Then I ended the call. My hands did not shake afterward. My chest did not tighten. I did not replay the conversation searching for mistakes. That absence of reaction told me more than any words could have. It told me I had crossed a threshold. Over the next week, I began making small changes that no one else would notice. I updated records, I redirected mail, I reviewed things I had ignored for years because they felt too final, too grown, too much like admitting time had passed. Each task was done quietly, without announcement. I did not explain myself to anyone, not even internally. There was a strange comfort in secrecy, not the secretive kind born of shame, but the kind that belongs to autonomy. Privacy I had not allowed myself before, plans that did not require approval or validation. At night, I slept deeply, not the heavy sleep of exhaustion, but the steady sleep of someone whose mind is not rehearsing conversations that may never happen. I dreamed less, and when I did dream, it was rarely of the past. Still, I knew this calm was temporary. They would push. They always did. People who benefit from your silence notice quickly when it changes. They interpret it not as growth, but as rebellion. And they were right about one thing. Something in me had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. I felt it most clearly one evening as I stood in the doorway of my own home, keys in hand, lights on inside, darkness gathering outside. I realized that for the first time in decades, this place was not waiting for anyone else. It was not holding space for promises made by others. It was complete on its own. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, not with finality, but with intention. And even as I did, I sensed that the next confrontation, when it came, would not be about feelings or misunderstandings. It would be about facts. The confrontation did not arrive the way I had once imagined it would. There was no shouting, no sudden visit, no dramatic demand made at my doorstep. It arrived instead through an envelope, plain and official, slid halfway into my mailbox on a quiet Tuesday morning. I recognized the logo immediately, a bank I had dealt with for most of my adult life, one I trusted, perhaps more than I should have. I carried the envelope inside and placed it on the table. I did not open it right away. I made tea first. I sat down. I waited until my hands felt steady, not because I was afraid of what it might contain, but because I wanted to read it as the person I had become, not the one I used to be. The letter was courteous, precise, and firm. It explained that there had been recent inquiries regarding accounts and properties associated with my name. It referenced documents, authorizations, requests for information that I had not personally initiated. The language was careful, but the implication was clear. Someone had been acting as though they still spoke for me. I felt no shock, only confirmation. I folded the letter neatly and placed it beside my cup. For a long moment, I stared at the wall opposite me, remembering how many times I had said yes without being asked, how often access had been granted simply because it always had been. People mistake long permission for permanent permission. They forget it can be revoked. That afternoon, I went to the bank in person. I dressed plainly. I brought only what I needed. There was no performance in me, no desire to appear wronged or fragile. I asked to speak with an advisor and waited patiently while the minutes passed. When we sat down, I listened more than I spoke. She explained the situation carefully, choosing her words with professional caution. My son and daughter-in-law had requested extensions, adjustments, reassurances. They had spoken confidently, referenced past arrangements, implied ongoing consent. They had assumed continuity. I asked a few questions, simple ones, direct ones. The answers were equally simple. Legally, the authority they believed they had no longer existed. Some documents had expired. Others had been revoked quietly, months earlier, when I had begun making changes no one noticed. Certain assets were no longer structured the way they remembered. Some responsibilities they believed were shared were, in fact, no longer mine. The advisor looked at me with something close to respect, not sympathy, respect. She asked if I wished to formalize further boundaries. I said yes. We spent the next hour reviewing everything slowly. Titles, accounts, signatures. Each adjustment was explained, each confirmation deliberate. I signed where needed, I declined where appropriate. No emotion entered the room, only clarity. When I left the bank, the air felt different, not lighter, not heavier, more defined, as if invisible lines had finally been drawn where they should have been all along. The call came that evening. This time, it was my daughter-in-law. Her voice was tight, controlled, polished in the way people speak when they believe restraint will give them leverage. She asked, without greeting, what I thought I was doing. I listened. I did not interrupt. I let her explain the inconvenience, the confusion, the sudden instability they were experiencing. She spoke of responsibilities, of family, of expectations that had been disrupted without warning. She spoke as though something had been taken from them unjustly. When she finished, I waited a moment longer. Silence unsettles people who rely on momentum. Then I told her the truth, calmly, precisely. I told her that nothing had been taken, that what had changed was access, not ownership. I told her that arrangements based on assumption were not agreements. I told her that support offered indefinitely without discussion was not a contract. She accused me of being cold, of planning this behind their backs, of choosing paperwork over people. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I corrected only one thing. I told her this was not sudden. It only felt sudden to them because they had not been paying attention. She said my son would be devastated. I said he was an adult. She said the children would suffer. I said children learn from what they observe. She said I was punishing them. I said consequences are not punishments. There was a long pause after that. I could hear her breathing on the line, measured but uneven. She asked if this was final. I told her yes. She hung up without saying goodbye. Later that night, my son called. His voice was different from hers, less controlled, more confused. He asked questions that revealed how much he had not known. He spoke as though pieces were missing from a story he thought he understood. I answered only what was asked, no more, no less. At one point, he said quietly that he never thought I would do something like this. I told him neither had I, and that was the truth. We ended the call politely. No resolution, no understanding reached, just an acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted and could not be shifted back. Afterward, I sat alone in the living room, lights low, the house wrapped in evening stillness. I did not feel victorious. I did not feel cruel. I felt aligned. For the first time, my reality matched my decisions. And yet, I knew this was not the end of it. Facts have a way of forcing emotions into the open. Documents clarify things feelings prefer to blur. What I had done could not be undone, and the implications would continue unfolding long after the call stopped. As I turned off the lamp and stood up, I understood that the hardest part was still ahead, not the confrontation, not the accusations, but what would come after when everyone finally realized that I was no longer available to be rewritten. The days after the calls passed more slowly than I expected, not because I was waiting for something, but because the air itself felt heavier, as though every interaction now carried weight. Decisions, once made, have a way of echoing. I could feel those echoes in the quiet moments, not as regret, but as awareness. My son did not call again, neither did his wife. The silence this time was different from the silences I had known before. It was not neglect disguised as busyness. It was distance chosen deliberately. I recognized it for what it was: withdrawal. When people lose access, they often retreat before they reflect. I did not chase them. I did not send messages to soften what had already been said. I had learned, finally, that clarity loses its strength when it is immediately followed by reassurance. Letting the silence stand was part of the consequence, not for them, but for me. Still, I felt the separation in small, unexpected ways. In the grocery store, I reached automatically for items I no longer needed to buy in bulk. I paused, adjusted, and placed them back on the shelf. At home, I noticed how quiet evenings stretched longer without the background noise of anticipation. I had spent years listening for footsteps that never came. Now there were none to listen for, and the habit had nowhere to land. One afternoon, a message arrived from a number I didn't recognize. It was brief, carefully worded, and unmistakably strategic. My daughter-in-law wrote that perhaps emotions had been running high, that misunderstandings had occurred, that maybe it would be wise to sit down together and talk things through like a family. She said the children missed me. I read the message twice, then I put the phone down. The invitation was not about connection, it was about negotiation. I could hear it in the phrasing, in the timing, in what was left unsaid. There was no acknowledgement of boundaries crossed, only an implied suggestion that my firmness had been an overreaction. I did not reply. That evening, I walked through the house again, the way I had done weeks earlier, but this time my steps were slower, more deliberate. I paused in rooms that once felt like holding areas for other people's lives. The guest room that stayed prepared year-round, the dining room set for numbers that never materialized, the corners of the house that had been waiting. I began making changes, not dramatic ones, subtle ones. I removed extra place settings. I repurposed the guest room into a space I would actually use. I rearranged furniture so that the house no longer pointed outward toward arrivals that might never happen, but inward toward comfort. Each small change felt like an acknowledgement of truth rather than a rejection of hope. The following week, my son called once more. His voice was quieter this time, less defensive. He said he had been thinking. He said things felt different now, unstable. He asked if I was really prepared for what this distance might mean. I told him I already knew. I told him that loneliness does not begin with separation. It begins when you are present but unseen. I told him I had lived with that kind of loneliness for decades, even when we spoke regularly, even when I helped endlessly. I told him this distance, painful as it might be, was at least honest. He did not argue. He did not apologize either. He said he needed time. I said I understood, and I meant it. After the call ended, I felt something tighten briefly in my chest, a reflex I recognized. It was grief, not for what was happening now, but for all the years I had waited for conversations like this that never came when they might have changed everything. I allowed myself to feel it. I did not rush past it. I sat with it, the way one sits with an old ache that flares up unexpectedly, acknowledging its presence without letting it dictate movement. Days turned into weeks. The tension softened, not because it resolved, but because it lost its immediacy. Life has a way of continuing even when relationships stall. I filled my time with routines that belonged to me. I read more. I went out more. I spent afternoons without explaining where I had been or why I enjoyed it. Occasionally, I wondered what stories were being told about me in my absence, whether I was being framed as cold, stubborn, unrecognizable. I decided it did not matter. Stories told without you rarely serve you anyway. One morning, I received a short message from my son. No accusations, no requests, just a statement that they were managing, that things were different, that he hoped I was well. I replied simply that I was. And for the first time, that was not a performance. It was not resilience masquerading as strength. It was a fact. That night, as I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked older, perhaps, but steadier, less like someone bracing for impact, more like someone standing on solid ground. The separation was real now, not dramatic, not explosive, just quiet, settled, and unmistakable. And as I turned off the light, I understood that while something had ended, something else had already begun to take its place. Not reconciliation, not revenge, but space. Time did what it always does when left alone. It moved forward without asking permission. Weeks folded into months, and the sharp edges of everything that had happened softened, not into forgetfulness, but into understanding. The separation that once felt deliberate and tense became simply the way things were. Not good, not bad, just true. I stopped measuring days by whether I heard from them. At first, I noticed the absence the way one notices a missing tooth with the tongue instinctively returning to the gap. Then, gradually, I stopped reaching for it. The space filled on its own, not with replacement relationships or distractions, but with a steadiness I had never known. My mornings became my own. I woke when my body told me to, not when obligations stirred me awake. I drank my tea slowly, sometimes watching the light move across the walls, sometimes reading, sometimes doing nothing at all. I learned that doing nothing was not a failure of purpose, it was rest, something I had denied myself for so long that it felt almost undeserved at first. I spent more time outside. I walked without destinations, letting my thoughts wander without steering them back toward old worries. I noticed things I had overlooked for years, the sound of leaves shifting, the quiet rhythm of my own steps, the way my breathing settled when no one was waiting for something from me. People began to comment on changes they couldn't quite name. They said I looked lighter, more present. I did not correct them. I did not explain. Some changes do not need translation. Occasionally, memories surfaced uninvited. Christmases prepared for and never attended, calls ended too quickly, promises spoken warmly and then forgotten. When they came, I did not push them away. I let them pass through me, like weather. They no longer carried the power to reopen wounds. They were simply part of the landscape of a life fully lived, even when parts of it had been painful. I thought about my grandchildren often, not with the sharp ache I once felt, but with a quiet hope that they would grow into people who understood boundaries earlier than I had, that they would learn somehow that love does not require erasure, that care does not demand self-abandonment. I accepted that I might not be the one to teach them that lesson directly. And that acceptance did not feel like surrender. It felt like wisdom. I reorganized my finances completely, not out of fear, but out of clarity. Everything was simple now, clean, understood. I knew exactly what belonged to me and what did not. That knowledge extended beyond paperwork. It applied to time, to energy, to emotional labor. I no longer offered those things reflexively. When my son called again months later, the conversation was different. Not warmer, not colder, just honest. He spoke of his life, I spoke of mine. There were pauses we did not rush to fill. There were things left unsaid that stayed that way. And when the call ended, I did not sit staring at the phone. I returned to what I had been doing. That, more than anything, told me how far I had come. The house, once a monument to waiting, became a place of living. I filled it with objects I liked, not things chosen for others. I hosted no grand dinners. I said no extra places. When I cooked, it was for myself or for friends who came without expectation and left without obligation. I learned that peace is not loud. It does not announce itself with dramatic moments or triumphant speeches. It arrives quietly, almost unnoticed, and stays because nothing inside you is trying to escape anymore. On the anniversary of the Christmas that had changed everything, I did something small but meaningful. I did not decorate. I did not prepare a meal for ghosts. I booked myself a short trip instead, somewhere calm, somewhere anonymous. I spent the holiday walking unfamiliar streets, eating in quiet restaurants, and returning each night to a room where no one knew my history. It was the most present I had ever felt on that day. There was no revenge in my heart, no satisfaction drawn from anyone else's discomfort. That surprised me once. I had imagined that standing up for myself would feel sharper, more dramatic. Instead, it felt gentle, like finally sitting down after a very long time on my feet. I understood now that my worth had never been tied to how much I gave, that love offered under pressure is not love, but habit, that saying no does not close doors to connection, it simply closes the door to exploitation. And perhaps most importantly, I learned that loneliness is not the absence of people, it is the absence of self. Once I returned to myself, the loneliness lost its grip. On a quiet evening, much like this one, I stood by the window and watched the lights come on across the neighborhood, lives unfolding behind walls I would never enter, stories I did not need to be part of to feel whole. I felt no bitterness, no longing, just a deep, steady sense of being exactly where I was meant to be. After decades of waiting to be chosen, I had finally chosen myself. And that choice did not isolate me. It freed me.